Cinder, Chapter 2. The emergency sirens hadn't faded before the hum of another engine rumbled into the square. The market's silence was split by feet thumping on the pavement and then someone spitting commands. Someone else's guttural response. Slinging her messenger bag across her back, Cinder crept across the dusty floor of her booth and pushed past the tablecloth that draped her work desk. She slipped her fingers into the gap of light beneath the door and inched it open. Pressing her cheek to the warm, gritty pavement, she was able to make out 3 sets of yellow boots across the square. An emergency crew. She peeled the door open farther, and watched the men, all wearing gas masks, as they doused the interior of their boots with liquid from a yellow can. Even across the square, Cinder wrinkled her nose at the stench. "What's happening?" Aiko asked from behind her. "They're going to burn Changji's booth." Cinder's eyes swept along the square, noting the pristine white hover planted near the corner. Other than the 3 men, the square was abandoned. Rolling onto her back, Cinder peered up into Aiko's sensor, still glowing faintly in the dark. "We'll leave when the flames start, when they're distracted." "Are we in trouble?" "No. I just can't be bothered with a trip to quarantines today." One of the men spouted an order, followed by the shuffling feet. Cinder turned her head and squinted through the gap. A flame was thrown into the booth. The smell of gasoline was soon met with that of burnt toast. The men stood back, their uniforms silhouetted against the glowing flames. Reaching up, Cinder grabbed Prince Kai's android around its neck and pulled it down beside her. Tucking it under one arm, she slid the door open enough to crawl through, keeping her eyes on the men's backs. Aiko followed, scooting against the next booth as Cinder lowered the door. They darted along the storefronts, most left wide open during the mass exodus, and they turned into the first skinny alley between shops. Black smoke blotted the sky above them. Seconds later, a horde of new hovers buzzed over the buildings along their way on to the market square. Cinder slowed when they put enough distance between them and the market, emerging from the maze of alleys. The sun had passed overhead and was descending behind the skyscrapers to the west. The air sweated with August heat, but an occasional warm breeze was funneled between the buildings, picking up whirlwinds of garbage from gutters. 4 blocks from the market, signs of life appeared again on the streets, pedestrians pooling on the sidewalks and gossiping about the plague outbreak in the city center. Net screens implanted into building walls shoved live feeds of fire and smoke in downtown New Beijing, and panicked headlines in which the toll of infected mounted by the second, even though only 1 person had been confirmed sick, so far as Cinder could tell. "All those sticky buns," Aiko said, as they passed close-up shot of the blackened booth. Cinder bit the inside corner of her cheek. Neither of them had ever sampled the acclaimed sweets of the market bakery. Aiko didn't have taste buds, and Chain Sacha didn't serve cyborgs. Towering offices and shopping centers gradually melded with a messy assortment of apartment buildings, built so close that they became an unending stretch of glass and concrete. Apartments in this corner of the city had once been spacious and desirable, but had been so subdivided and remodeled over time, always trying to cram more people into the same square footage, that the building had become a labyrinth of corridors and stairwells. But all the crowded ugliness was briefly forgotten as Cinder turned the corner onto her own street. For half a step, New Beijing Palace could be glimpsed between complexes sprawling and serene on the cliff that overlooked the city. The palace's pointed gold roofs sparkled orange beneath the sun. The windows glinted the light back at the city, the ornate gables, the tiered pavilions that tethered dangerously close to the cliff's edge, the rounded temples stretching to the heavens. Cinder paused longer than usual to look up at it, thinking about someone who lived beyond those walls, who was up there perhaps this very second. Not that she hadn't known the prince lived there for every time she had seen the palace before, But today she felt a connection she'd never had before, and with it, almost a smug delight. She had met the prince. He had come to her booth. He knew her name. Sucking in a breath of humid air, Cinder forced herself to turn away. Feeling childish, she was going to surround like Peony. She shifted the royal android to her other arm as she and Aiko ducked beneath the overhang of the Phoenix Tower apartments. She flashed her free wrists at the ID scanner on the wall and heard the clunking of the lock. Aiko used her arm extensions to clop down the stairs as they descended into the basement, a dim maze of storage space caged with chicken wire. As a wave of musty air blew up to meet the android, turned on the floodlight, dispersing the shadow and the sparse halogens. It was a familiar path from the stairwell to storage space numbered 18 to 20, the cramped, always chilly cell that Audrey allowed Cinder to use for her work. Cinder cleared a space for the android among the work table's clutter and set her messenger bag on the floor. She swapped her heavy work gloves for less grungy cotton ones before locking up the storage room. If Audrey asked, she said as they made their way to the elevators, "Our booth is nowhere near the baker's." Aiko's light flickered. Noted. They were alone in the elevator. It wasn't until they stepped out onto the 18th floor of the building that became a crawling hive. Children chasing each other down the corridors, both domestic and stray cats creeping tight against the walls, the ever-consistent blur of net screen chatter spilling from the doorways. Cinder adjusted the white noise output from her brain interface as she dodged the children on her way to the apartment. The door was wide open, making Cinder pause and check the number before entering. She heard Audrey's stiff voice from the living room, lower neckline for Peony. "She looks like an old woman." Cinder peered around the corner. Audrey was standing with one hand on the mantel of the holographic fireplace, wearing a chrysanthemum embroidered bathrobe that blended in with the collection of garish paper fans that covered the wall behind her, reproductions made to look antique. With her face shimmering with too much powder and her lips painted horrifically bright, Audrey almost looked like a reproduction herself. Her face was made up as if she had been planning to go somewhere, although she rarely left the apartment. If she noticed Cinder loitering in the doorway, she ignored her. The net screen above the heatless flames was showing footage from the market. The baker's booth had been reduced to rubble, and the skeleton of the portable oven. In the center of the room, Pearl and Peony each stood, swathed in silk and tulle. Peony was holding up her dark curly hair, while a woman Cinder didn't recognize fidgeted with her dress neckline. Peony caught sight of Cinder over the woman's shoulder, and her eyes sparked. A glowing burst across her face. She gestured with the dress, barely a silent squeal. Cinder grinned back. Her youngster stepsister looked angelic, her dress all silver and shimmering, with hints of lavender when caught in the fire's light. "Pearl!" Audrey gestured at her old daughter with a twirling finger, and Pearl spun around, displaying a row of pearl buttons down her back. Her dress matched Peony's, with its snug bodice and flouncy skirt. Only it was a stardust gold. Let's take in her waist some more. Threading a pin through the hem of Peony's neckline, the stranger started at seeing Cinder in the doorway, but quickly turned away. Stepping back, the woman removed a bundle of sharp pins from between her lips and tilted her head to one side. "It's already very snug," she said. "We want her to dance, don't we?" "We want her to find a husband," said Audrey. No, the seamstress tithered, even as she reached out and pinched the material around Pearl's waist. Cinder could tell Pearl was sucking in her stomach as she could. She detected the edge of the ribs beneath the fabric. "She is much too young for marriage." "I'm 17, Pearl said, glancing at the woman. 17, see? A child now is for fun, right, girl?" "She is too expensive for fun," said Audrey. "I expect results from this gown." "Don't worry, Linji. She will be as lovely as morning dew." Stuffing the pins back into her mouth, the woman returned her focus to Peony's neckline. Audrey lifted her chin and finally acknowledged Cinder's presence by swiping her gaze down Cinder's filthy boots and cargo pants. "Why aren't you at the market?" "It's closed down early today," said Cinder, with a meaningful look at the net screen that Audrey didn't follow. Finging nonchalance. Cinder thrust a throb towards the hall. "So I'll just go get cleaned up and I'll be ready for my dress fitting." The seamstress paused. "Another dress, Lindsay? I did not bring material for." "Have you replaced the mag belt on the hover yet?" Cinder's smile faltered. "No, not yet." "Well, none of us will be going to the ball unless we get that fixed, will we?" Cinder stifled her irritation. They'd already had this conversation twice in the past. "I need money to buy a new mag belt. 800 units, at least. If income from the market wasn't deposited directly into your account, I would have bought one by now. And trust you not to spend it all on your frivolous toys." Audrey said toys with a glance at Aiko and curled up her lip. "Even though Aiko technically belonged to her, besides, I can't even afford both a mag belt and a new dress that you'll only wear once. You'll have to find some other way of fixing the hover, or you will find your own gown for the ball." Irritation hardened in Cinder's gut. She might have pointed out that Pearl and Peony could have been ready-made rather than custom dresses in order to budget for Cinder's as well. She might have pointed out that they would only wear their dresses one time too. She might have pointed out that, as she was the one doing the work, the money should have been hers to spend as she saw fit. But all arguments would come to nothing. Legally, Cinder belonged to Audrey as much as the household android, and so too did her money, her few possessions, even the new foot she'd just attached. Audrey loved to remind her of that, so she stomped the anger down before Audrey could see a spark of rebellion. "I may be able to offer a trade for the mag belt. I'll check the local shops." Audrey stifled. "Why don't we trade that worthless android for it?" Aiko ducked behind Cinder's legs. "We wouldn't get much for her," said Cinder. "Nobody wants such an old model." "No, they don't, do they?" "Perhaps I will have to sell both of you off as spare parts." Audrey reached forward and fidgeted with the unfinished hem of Pearl's sleeve. "I don't care how you fix the hover. Just fix it before the ball, and cheaply. I don't need that pile of junk taking up valuable parking space." Cinder tucks her hands into her back pockets. "Are you saying that if I fix the hover and get a dress, I can really go this year?" Audrey's lips puckered slightly at the corners. "It will be a miracle if you can find something suitable to wear that will hide your..." Her gaze dropped to Cinder's boots. "Eccentricities. But yes, if you fix the hover, I suppose you can go to the ball." Peony flashed Cinder a stunned half-smile, while her older sister spun on their mother. "You can't be serious. Her go with us?" Cinder pressed her shoulder into the doorframe, trying to hide her disappointment from Peony. Pearl's outrage was unnecessary. A little orange light had flickered in the corner of Cinder's vision. Audrey had not yet met her promise. "Well," she said, attempting to look heartened, "I guess I'd better go find a mag belt then." Audrey flourished her arm at Cinder, her attention once again captivated by Pearl's dress. A silent dismissal. Cinder cast one more look at her stepsister's sumptuous gowns before backing into the room. She had barely turned toward the hallway when Peony squealed, "Prince Kai!" Freezing. Cinder glanced back at the net screen. The plague alerts had been replaced by a live broadcast from the palace's press room. Prince Kai was speaking to the crowd of journalists, human and android. "Volume on," said Pearl, battering the seamstress away. "Research continues to be our top priority," Prince Kai was saying, gripping the sides of the podium. "Our research team is determined to find a vaccine for the disease that has now taken one of my parents and threatens to take the other, as well as tens of thousands of our citizens. The circumstances are made even more desperate in the face of the outbreak occurred today within the city limits. No longer can we claim this disease is relegated to the poor, rural communities of our country. Letimosis threatens us all, and we will have to find a way to stop it. Only then can we begin to rebuild our economy and return to the Eastern Commonwealth to its once prosperous state. An enthusiastic applause shifted through the crowd. Research on the plague had been underway since the first outbreak had occurred in a small town in African Union over a dozen years ago. It seemed that very little progress had been made. Meanwhile, the disease had surfaced in hundreds of seemingly unconnected communities throughout the world. Hundreds of thousands of people had fallen ill, suffered, died. Even Audrey's husband had contracted it on a trip to Europe, the same trip during which he had agreed to become the guardian of an 11-year-old orphan cyborg. One of Cinder's few memories of the man was him being carted away to the quarantines of Audrey, raved at how he could not leave her with this thing. Audrey never talked about her husband, and few memories of him lingered in the apartment. The only reminder that he had ever existed was found in the row of holographic plaques and carved medallions that lined the fireplace mantel, achievement awards and congressional prizes from an international technology fair 3 years running. Cinder had no idea what he invented. Evidently, whatever it was hadn't taken off, because he'd left his family for almost no money when he had died. On the screen, the prince's speech was interrupted when a stranger stepped onto the platform and handed a note to Prince Kai. The prince's eyes clouded over, the screen blackened. The press room was replaced with a desk before a blue screen. A woman sat behind it, emotionless, but with the whitened knuckles atop the desk. We interrupt His Imperial Highness press conference with an update on the status of Imperial Majesty Emperor Riken. The Emperor's physicians have informed us that His Majesty has entered the third stage of lechumosis. Gasping, the seamstress pulled the pins from her mouth. Cinder pressed herself against the doorframe. She had not even thought to give Kai her condolences or wishes for the Emperor's return from health. He must think of her so sensitive, so ignorant. We are told that everything is being done to ensure His Imperial Majesty's comfort at this time, and palace officials tell us that researchers are working non-stop in their search for a vaccine. Volunteers are still urgently needed for antidote testing, even as the cyborg draft continues. There has been way more controversy regarding the 126th annual Peace Festival due to the Emperor's illness, but Prince Kyato has told the press festival will continue as scheduled, and that he hopes it might bring some joy to this otherwise tragic time. The anchor paused, hesitating, even with the prompter before her. Her face softened, and her stiff voice warbled as she finished, "Long live the Emperor!" The seamstress murmured the words back to the anchor. The screen went black again before returning to the press conference, but Prince Kai had left the stage, and the audience of journalists was in an upheaval as they reported to their individual cameras. "I know a cyborg who could volunteer for the plague testing," said Pearl. "Why wait for the draft?" Cinder leveled at a glare at Pearl, who was nearly 6 inches shorter than despite being a year older. "Good idea," she said. "And then you could get a job to pay for your pretty dress." Pearl snarled. They reimbursed the volunteer's family's wirehead. The cyborg draft could have been started by some royal research team a year ago. Every morning, a new ID number was drawn from the pool of many thousands of cyborgs who resided in the Eastern Commonwealth. Subjects had been carted in from provinces as far-reaching as Mumbai and Singapore to act as guinea pigs for the antidote testing. It was made out to be some sort of honor, giving your life for the good of humanity, but it was really just a reminder that cyborgs are not like everyone else. Not many of them have been given a second chance at life by the generous hand of scientists, and therefore owed their very existence to those who had created them. They were lucky to have lived this long, many thought. It's only right that they should have the first to give up their lives in search for a cure. "We can't volunteer Cinder," said Peony, bunching her skirt in her hand. "I need her to fix my port screen." Pearl sniffed and turned away from both of them. Peony scrunched her nose at her sister's back. "Stop bickering," said Audrey. "Peony, you're wrinkling your skirt." Cinder stepped back in the hallway, and the seamstress returned to her work. Aiko was already 2 steps ahead of her, eager to escape Audrey's presence. She appreciated Peony coming to her defense. Of course, she knew in the end it wouldn't matter. Audrey would never volunteer her for the testing, because that would be the end of her only income, and Cinder was sure her stepmother had never worked a day in her life. But if the draft chose her, no one could do anything about it, and it seemed that lately a disappropriate number of those chosen from the new Beijing and surrounding suburbs. Every time one of the draft victims was a teenage girl, Cinder imagined a clock ticking inside her head. The end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3.